Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the balance of global power has shifted quietly, steadily, and irreversibly. For decades, the West told the story. Africa was poor. Africa was corrupt. Africa needed saving. But behind the scenes, Africa wasn't begging, it was building. While Washington and Paris debated sanctions and wars, African nations were connecting, trading, digitizing, and re-engineering the future. And now, in 2025, that sleeping giant has finally opened its eyes. From the cobalt mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo to the oil fields of Nigeria, from the lithium corridors of Zimbabwe to the solar farms of Kenya, and from Ghana's digital banks to South Africa's automotive revolution, Africa is no longer the supplier of cheap resources. It's the powerhouse behind the global economy. The shocking part? You're already using African resources every single day. Your phone, your laptop, your car battery, even the global food supply chain, all rely on Africa's trillion-dollar base of minerals, energy, agriculture, and innovation. What was once dismissed as the third world is now shaping a $30 trillion global market, and the West is struggling to keep up. America's dollar dominance? Weakening. Europe's control over raw materials? Gone. The IMF and World Bank? Losing relevance fast. Because while the world wasn't paying attention, Africa built its own ecosystem, a network of trade, payment systems, and investment partnerships that no longer depend on Washington or Brussels. And here's the twist. It's not just China that's helping Africa rise anymore. It's Africa helping itself. Through the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, the world's largest free trade zone, 1.4 billion people are uniting their economies into one unstoppable force. This new system could generate over $30 trillion in combined market power by 2050. That's more than the GDPs of the U.S. and Europe combined. And while Western politicians were laughing, African leaders were signing billion-dollar energy, tech, and logistics deals. New railways, new ports, new digital banks, new payment platforms that use African currencies instead of the U.S. dollar. It's the beginning of the Great Reversal, a new global order where Africa doesn't just participate. It leads. Let's rewind. For decades, Africa was seen only as a supplier. The West extracted raw materials, gold, oil, coffee, and diamonds, and sold them back as finished goods at 10 times the price. But something started changing around 2010. New leaders began asking tough questions. Why should African gold fund London's economy? Why should African oil fuel American industries while African homes remain dark? Why can't Africa refine, process, and export its own products? This question became the spark for an entire generation of change. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa began investing billions into refineries, processing plants, and tech industries. Kenya, Rwanda, and Tanzania launched digital payment systems, some of the fastest-growing fintech platforms in the world. And nations like Zimbabwe, Namibia, and DR Congo began restricting the export of unprocessed minerals, forcing global companies to build factories inside Africa if they wanted access. The result? A tidal wave of investment worth hundreds of billions. Take Ghana, for example. It used to export gold and cocoa in raw form. Now it's setting up processing facilities that triple the value of exports. Nigeria, once dependent on imported fuel, is now refining its own oil at massive new facilities like the Dangote refinery, the largest in Africa. Meanwhile, Kenya and Egypt are leading Africa's clean energy race with solar and wind projects that rival European capacity. And in the background, the world's hunger for technology, electric vehicles, smartphones, renewable energy, depends entirely on Africa's minerals: cobalt from Congo, lithium from Zimbabwe, nickel from Tanzania, rare earth elements from Malawi. Together, these feed a $30 trillion global supply chain, and Africa is now in control. Western nations are panicking because Africa is rewriting the rules, no longer signing one-sided deals. Instead of selling cheap, Africa is now partnering smart. Deals with China, Russia, India, and even the Gulf states are structured differently. Infrastructure in exchange for value, not control. Technology transfer instead of debt. And that's what terrifies Washington. For the first time, Africa is operating independently, outside of the Western financial chokehold. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPSS, allows countries to trade using their local currencies, bypassing the U.S. dollar completely. This is not just economics, it's revolution. When Kenya trades coffee with Ghana, they no longer need dollars. When Nigeria sells oil to South Africa, the transaction happens within the African banking network. In 2025, CAMISA, ECOWAS, and the AfCFTA linked these systems together, creating a continental market worth over $10 trillion today and growing fast. But what's even more powerful than the numbers is the mindset shift. African leaders are no longer asking for aid. They're demanding respect. President William Ruto of Kenya publicly declared that Africa will no longer depend on Western currencies. Mali's and Burkina Faso's new economic bloc, the AES Alliance, is building gold-backed currency systems. South Africa is championing BRICS expansion, pushing for a world where the global South dictates the next century of trade. Meanwhile, in the US and Europe, industries are struggling. The renewable energy revolution needs Africa's minerals. The semiconductor supply chain needs Africa's rare earths. Even agriculture, the breadbasket of the future, is moving south. Africa's arable land makes up 60% of the world's total uncultivated farmland. By 2030, Africa's food exports could reach $1 trillion, feeding Asia and Europe while the U.S. faces droughts, inflation, and rising debt. It's a silent takeover, not through war, but through trade, technology, and time. The world once called Africa the Dark Continent. But now, it's the one shining the light on a collapsing world order. The same nations once colonized and divided are uniting under a single vision: control their resources, trade on their own terms, and build for their own people. And here's what the West fears most. Africa isn't rising against anyone. Africa is simply rising for itself. The power shift is unstoppable. $30 trillion in natural wealth, $10 trillion in trade potential, 1.4 billion young, driven minds building a future on African soil. While Washington debates, Africa builds. While Europe complains, Africa creates. And while the old world clings to power, Africa is quietly taking it back. The future doesn't belong to those who conquered the past. It belongs to those who are building the next chapter. And that next chapter is being written right now in Africa.